A harsh metallic slam rang out as the gray and white German Shepherd frantically threw itself against the kennel door. It had just attacked an animal control officer, and the immediate order for euthanasia was given at that exact moment. Franklin, a man who had lived in isolation for 15 years and never stopped his truck for any reason, suddenly killed his engine. He stepped out of his truck, ignoring the yelling officer. He just stared at the dog, his face pale. He wasn't just seeing a panicked animal. He was recognizing a sign he had seen only once before, right before the bomb detonated in Afghanistan, Jeremiah 38. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence in Franklin's cabin was more than just an absence of noise. It was a physical presence. It was the sound of 15 years passing one deliberate lonely day at a time. The only things that broke it were the hiss of the wood stove in winter and the low growl of his old truck's engine, an event that happened only 4 times a year. Today was one of those days. Franklin stood by the cabin's single window, watching the sun crest the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo. Range, he was a man in his mid-50s, 1 to 17, tall and cut from a lean, hard-working cloth that had refused to soften with age. His brown hair, long enough to brush his collar, was heavily salted with gray at the temples. A dense, slightly unkempt beard and mustache covered a face that looked carved from weathered pine, scored with lines of hardship. But his eyes, when they bothered to look at anyone, held no cruelty. He pulled on his boots, the leather cracked and dark with use. He ran a hand through his hair, settled a worn cap on his head, and shrugged into his old brown leather jacket. He left it unzipped, revealing the red and dark navy plaid shirt beneath it. 155. He didn't check a list after 15 years. The list was a scar on his memory: flour salt, coffee kerosene, and truck fuel. Anything else was a luxury, and luxury was a complication. He had come to these mountains in 2005, seeking an altitude high enough to escape the man he had been. He left the world below, and in return the world had agreed to leave him alone. His truck, a vintage model from the 1990s, protested the cold morning air with a groan, but the engine turned over. Franklin backed onto the gravel track, his movements precise and economical. The drive down the mountain was beautiful, 0237. A winding descent through aspen and pine that opened up onto the vast high desert mesa. Franklin saw none of it. He saw only the road, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his gaze distant. He drove into the outskirts of Taos, a town that thrived on art tourism and history, none of which mattered to him. He timed his trips to avoid crowds. A Tuesday morning in the off-season was usually safe. His destination was an old feed and supply store on the edge of town, a place that smelled of dust and fertilizer and didn't ask questions to get there. He had to pass the county animal shelter, ISO 319. It was his least favorite part of the drive. He hated the place. It was a concrete box of endings. He never looked at it directly. He always fixed his gaze on the opposite side of the road, on the sagebrush stretching to the horizon, and drove a little faster. Today he couldn't. The sound hit him first, cutting through his closed windows. It was not the usual sad yelping. This was a raw, percussive sound of frantic barking punctuated by a heavy rhythmic slam. It was the sound of a large body throwing itself against metal, Euro 355. Then a man's sharp cry of pain, cry against every instinct he had spent 15 years building. Franklin slowed the truck. He pulled onto the gravel shoulder. 50 yards from the shelter's chain-link gate, he saw 2 men. One in a county uniform was stumbling back from a transport kennel on the side of a truck. This was David, an animal control officer, and he was clutching his forearm, his face pale with shock and anger. Blood seeped through the thick canvas of his sleeve. The other man, older with the weary look of a man who had seen too much, was Jared, the shelter director. Donjo 433. David, are you? That's it. Jared, it's done. David's voice was tight with pain. That thing is rabid. I want it euthanized. Now I'm not putting it in the kennels. You can't make me. Franklin's gaze shifted from the men to the transport kennel. The source of the chaos was a blur of gray and white fur, a large German shepherd thrashing inside the cage with a terrifying, mindless violence. It would lunge, hit the metal door with a sickening thud, spin and lunge. Again, it was not attacking. It was trying to get out, trying to escape an invisible prison. Franklin's hand, which had been resting on the gear shift, tightened. 0515. Turn around. The voice, in his head, said. The voice that had kept him safe for 15 years. Not your problem. Not your world. Drive away. This was the very thing he had left the world to escape the chaos, the pain, the responsibility. He put the truck in gear, and his foot moved to the accelerator. He physically turned his head, ready to merge back onto the road. He would go to the store, get his supplies, and be back on his mountain before noon. He took one last glance in his side mirror, and he froze. His foot came off the pedal, Auto 554. The truck idled. Something was wrong with the dog's posture. He was a handler. He knew dogs. He had lived, breathed, and slept. Dogs for 2 decades of his life. This wasn't just rage. He killed the engine, the sudden silence of the cab, ringing in his ears. He got out. He stood by his truck, ignoring the shouts from David. He watched the dog, and his blood ran cold. The dog's eyes were not narrowed in aggression. They were wide, the pupils blown, showing the whites all around its ears were not forward, not challenging. They were pinned flat back against its skull, 0632. So flat they almost disappeared into the ruff of its neck. Its body was trembling, not with anger, but with a deep, vibrating terror. But it was the head that was the part that stopped Franklin's heart. The dog was not focused on the men. It was not focused on the kennel door. It was hitting between lunges. Its head snapped up its muzzle, pointing to the sky, scanning the roofline of the shelter, scanning the empty blue horizon, as if the threat wasn't in front of it, but was coming from above. He's scanning. Franklin whispered the words lost in the wind. He's looking for the high ground, 0711. The smell of diesel and hot dust filled his nostrils. The bright New Mexico morning dissolved. It was 2005. The heat was a physical weight. He was in Kandahar, the air thick with pulverized earth. He was walking 20 feet behind Max, his K9 partner, his other half. Max, a magnificent black and tan. Shepard had been working the scent line for half a mile. Suddenly Max stopped. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He froze. His eyes went wide, his ears pinned flat, and his head snapped up, scanning the rooftops of the Emwood brick compound at 0749. They were approaching. Franklin had grabbed his radio. Max is alerting high threat. He's scanning the rooftops. A sharp click echoed from a nearby speaker, followed by the whistle of an incoming mortar. The world exploded. Franklin stood by his truck. The sound of David shouting, a distant buzz. He was shaking. He couldn't breathe. He was not seeing a transport kennel. He was seeing a Emwood brick wall. He was not seeing a gray and white shepherd. He was seeing Max, frozen in that last moment of terrible certainty. The dog in the kennel lunged again, and its high-pitched cry of terror was not a bark. Adage 0828. It was a sound of profound trauma. It was the exact specialized PTSD response of a dog trained for combat. A dog who had learned that threats came from above. "It's not your problem," Franklin said to himself, his voice hoarse, but it was a lie. The memory had anchored him. The ghost of Max in that kennel would not let him leave. David was still yelling, "Get the pole, we're putting it down right here." Franklin's legs felt like lead, but he moved. He took one heavy step, not back toward the mountain, but toward Jared. "Wait," Franklin said, 0907. It was the first word he had spoken to a stranger in over a year, and the sound of his own voice was as shocking as the scene in front of him. The word hung in the air, thin and rough from disuse. "Wait." David froze his hand halfway to a catchpole leaning against the shelter wall. Jared, the shelter director, turned his full attention to the stranger. He knew of this man. Everyone in town did. Franklin the mountain man, the recluse who bought his supplies in bulk and spoke to no one in 5 years as director. Jared had never heard him speak. Franklin took a slow step forward, Ojo 947, his old work boots silent on the gravel. He wore the uniform Jared always saw him in, faded blue jeans, a worn brown leather jacket over a plaid shirt, and a cap pulled low. He looked lean, healthy, and profoundly tired. "Can I help you?" Jared asked, his voice defaulting to the professional calm he'd perfected as a police captain. Franklin's gaze was not on Jared, but on the transport kennel. The shepherd inside had paused its assault, its flanks heaving, chest covered in drool and foam. The dog. Franklin said, his voice was a low rasp. "Where did it come from?" "Owner surrender this morning, 10:29. Jared said, stepping between Franklin and the agitated David, said he was vicious. Looks like he was right. He just put one of my best officers out of commission. David, clutching his bleeding arm, spat onto the gravel. Vicious, that thing is a menace, Jared. It tried to take my arm off. It needs to be put down before it hurts someone else. I want it done now. Franklin ignored David completely. His eyes locked on the kennel. He saw the terror. He saw the way the dog's paws were bleeding from clawing the metal. He saw the ghost of Max, 1105. He's not vicious. Franklin stated it wasn't an opinion. It was a diagnosis. He's terrified. Jared let out a long, weary sigh. He'd heard this before from well-meaning volunteers who saw potential in every lost cause. Son terrified, vicious. It often looks the same. From this side of the bars, I've been doing this for 20 years. First on the force now. Here I know. The look that dog he motioned toward the kennel is beyond saving. He's too far gone. He's a liability. We can't afford, and a danger to my staff. The kindest thing we can do now is put him down, humanely. A heavy silence settled, 11:49. Franklin looked from the dog to Jared, then back to the dog. He saw the finality in Jared's eyes, the anger in David's, and the panic in Wolf's. He felt the old familiar weight of failure pressing down on him, the same weight that had crushed him in 2005. He had failed Max. He had run from the world, and now the first time he'd stopped running, he was being told to walk away from this too. Let me try. Franklin said the words coming out before he could stop them. David let out a short, incredulous laugh. Try what? Get yourself killed. That shepherd will rip your throat out, old man. 12:27. Jared just looked confused. The situation had gone from a standard emergency to something strange. Mr. Franklin, isn't it? Try what exactly? What do you do? Franklin's jaw tightened. He had not said the words aloud to another person since he'd buried his uniform. The admission felt like tearing open the scar. I was a handler, he said, his voice dropping even lower. K9, the two letters changed the air. David's scoffing died. Jared, the ex-cop, suddenly saw the stranger in a new light. He saw the way Franklin stood, not aggressively, but perfectly balanced. He saw the quiet authority, 1309, that had been there all along, hidden under the beard and the isolation, K9. Jared repeated, tasting the word. He made a decision. David, go to the clinic, get that arm stitched. That's an order. But Jared, the dog, I will handle the dog. Go, Jared's voice had the steel of a man who was used to being obeyed. David, glaring at Franklin, finally turned and stalked toward his truck, presumably to drive himself to the urgent care clinic. Jared turned back to Franklin. He's right about one thing. It's a risk. I cannot let you in that kennel. My insurance, my county board. They'd shut me down. Franklin nodded. 13:53. I don't need to go in. He's still in the transport unit. Just leave him. Just give me space. And do you have a stool? A simple wooden stool. Inside the shelter's small front office, Meredith, the new veterinary technician, had been watching the entire drama through the blinds. She had her hand over her mouth, horrified by David's injury and the sheer violence from the dog. She was young, idealistic, and dreaded what came next. The needle and the quiet, heavy walk to the freezer. Now she watched, completely baffled, as her boss, Jared, went to the feed supply shed and retrieved an old 1435 three-legged milking stool. She watched as Franklin took the stool. He walked calmly to a spot on the gravel, about 10 feet from the transport kennel, on the truck he did not face. The dog, he sat down, positioning himself so he was partially turned away, offering his side, not a direct confrontational stance. The dog, who had been quiet watching the exchange, renewed its panic. Seeing this new human settle in it, began to bark a deep, explosive sound of terror that seemed to shake the truck. It lunged at the bars, hitting the metal with a heavy, solid thud. Franklin did not flinch. 15:16. He did not look from the deep inner pocket of his leather jacket. Franklin pulled out a very old dog-eared paperback. The cover was missing. The pages yellowed. He opened it to a marked page and began to read. Or at least he appeared to read. His eyes were on the page, but his entire being, every nerve, was tuned to the animal, 10 feet away. He was an island of absolute calm in the center of the storm. Inside the office, Meredith turned to Jared. What is he doing? That dog is going to give itself a heart attack. He's ignoring it. No, Jared said, his eyes narrowed in intense observation. 15:57. He's not ignoring it. He's outlasting it. Watch the shepherd's frantic rhythm began to break. It would lunge, bark, and slam against the metal and be met with nothing. No yelling, no rattling, pole, no threat. Just the scent of a calm man and the whisper of the wind. It lunged again, barked, stopped. It stared at the man. The man turned a page. The dog let out a frustrated, confused noise, half bark, half whine. It was being met with a language it did not understand. Absolute neutrality. The furious barking subsided into a low, rumbling growl. The dog was still coiled, 1638, a spring of terror, but the blind panic was fading. Franklin, without looking up, slowly turned another page. The growling stopped. The shepherd was panting now, its sides wet, its tongue lolling. It was exhausted. It slid down onto its belly. But its head was still up, ears swiveling, eyes locked on the strange, quiet man. Confusion had replaced terror. This human was breaking all the rules. He was not a threat. He was not a comfort. He was just there. The dog's rapid, shallow breathing began to deepen. It was shifting from pure fight or flight panic to tense, exhausted observation. 1720. Franklin sat there for an hour. The sun climbed higher, warming the gravel. He turned 3 more pages. The only sounds were the distant highway and the occasional jingle of a tag from the main kennel building. Finally, Franklin slowly closed his book. He placed it carefully back in his pocket. He stood up, his movements unhurried. The dog instantly tensed, scrambling to its feet, a low growl starting deep in its chest. Franklin did not look at it. He picked up the stool, his back still mostly to the animal, and walked back toward the office. He stopped in front of Jared, who had come outside to meet him. 18 seconds. That was something Jared said, unsure what else to say. What now? Franklin looked past him, up toward the mountains that were his refuge. I'll be back tomorrow. He walked to his truck, climbed in, and started the engine. He drove away, leaving Jared and Meredith staring after him. And in the transport kennel, Wolf, the gray and white shepherd, lay down in the first true heavy silence he had known. In days, his eyes never leaving the spot where the silent man had been. He returned the next morning, just as the sun was clearing the mountains. 1838. The old truck pulled into the same spot. Jared, sipping coffee by the office door, gave a single short nod. Franklin nodded back. The acknowledgement was all the conversation they needed. Jared had moved the gray shepherd out of the transport unit and into a secure concrete kennel run in the quarantine wing. It was isolated, giving the dog space while ensuring staff safety. The 3-legged stool was waiting for Franklin, right by the entrance to the wing. Franklin picked it up and walked to the run. Wolf was already a storm of noise the moment he'd seen the truck. The deep percussive barking had started. 1919. He was launching himself at the chain-link gate. His teeth bared the sound of desperate rattling slam of metal on metal. Franklin did exactly what he had done the day before. He placed the stool 10 feet away, sat down, turned his body partially away, and opened his book. He read, or he appeared to read. He tracked the lines on the page, but his senses were focused entirely on the animal. The frantic barking continued for 20 minutes. Then, just like before it faltered, the rhythm broke. The dog was being met with infuriating, incomprehensible calm. 1956. The barks subsided into low chest rumbling growls. Wolf backed away from the gate, his paws bleeding slightly onto the concrete. He retreated to the far corner, lay down but kept his head up, eyes locked on the silent man. Franklin turned a page. This was their new routine. It held for 2 more days. Franklin arrived. Wolf exploded in a show of terror and defensive fury. Franklin sat. The fury would exhaust itself, burning out against the man's profound stillness. Then silence, heavy and tense, would stretch for hours, and then Franklin would leave. 2036. On the 3rd day of this ritual, a Friday, something changed. The initial explosion from Wolf was shorter. It lasted only 5 minutes when the dog retreated to his corner. He lay down and put his head on his paws. Though every muscle in his body remained coiled, ready to spring, Franklin watched him from the corner of his eye. He sensed the shift. The dog was no longer just panicked. He was frustrated. He was waiting for the next step, for the threat that always eventually came. Franklin slowly closed his book and placed it on the gravel beside the stool. He looked at the dog, not directly in the eyes. 2116. That was a challenge, but at his ears he had spent the last 3 days reliving Kandahar, reliving Max. He remembered the language they had shared, a private world built on German commands and subtle shifts in weight, a language of trust. He hadn't spoken in 15 years. His throat felt thick, rusty sits. He said the word was a low, rough murmur, barely louder than the wind. Wolf's head snapped up his ears, which had been pinned back in fear. instantly shot forward, swiveling like radar dishes, trying to triangulate the sound. He didn't sit. He scrambled to his feet. Confused, 2159. He knew that word. It was buried deep beneath the trauma, but it was there. Franklin kept his voice low, rhythmic almost like a prayer, using the tones of calm praise, not sharp command. Sitz guter Junge. Sit, good boy. Wolf's entire body was a question. He backed up, hit the wall, and let out a single confused bark. Platz, Franklin murmured the word aching in his chest. Downey remembered saying it to Max in the belly of a C-130. The vibration of the floor, Max's warm body, a solid presence against his leg. Blib, Franklin whispered, 2242, stay. He wasn't commanding this dog. He was communing with a ghost. He was speaking to the soldier he knew was trapped inside that terrified animal. Wolf paced, whining the sounds of his trauma, fighting with the muscle memory of his training from the office. Meredith watched a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands. She had seen Franklin's strange routine, but today she heard the words. She saw the dog's immediate electric reaction. She made a decision. She grabbed a second mug, filled it, and walked outside. Franklin heard her approach on the gravel, and his entire body tensed. 2320. He hated intrusions. He was in a delicate, fragile space, and this was an interruption he didn't need. Mr. Franklin. He didn't turn. Ma'am Meredith stopped a few feet away. I brought you some coffee. It's cold out here. You haven't moved in hours. He slowly turned. He saw the young woman, her face open and kind. Her eyes filled with a concern that wasn't pity. He hesitated, then took the mug. Thank you? I heard you, she said, nodding toward the kennel. The German. I think you're right about him. I think I know why you're right. Franklin looked at her, his brows furrowed, 2404. He was surrendered, Meredith said, lowering her voice 5 days ago. The man who brought him in, he was awful. He stormed in, dragged the dog by a choke chain, and said he was broken and uncontrollable, said if we didn't take him, he'd shoot him. We had no choice. She took a breath. The man was angry. He threw a plastic sleeve of paperwork at the desk, said it was useless garbage. I'm the intake coordinator. I file the papers. Meredith reached into the pocket of her scrubs. She pulled out a folded clear plastic sleeve. I scanned the microchip. It was restricted, 2443, listed to a private security contractor. But these papers, these were his discharge papers. She handed them to Franklin. His hands, usually so steady, had a slight tremor. He took the papers through the plastic. He saw the Department of Defense emblem. He saw a DD, Form 2209, the K9 medical record. He saw the discharge certificate, K9 IDW 442, name, Wolf status, military, working dog, multi-purpose, K9, discharge 2023. He was a soldier, Meredith whispered, tears welling in her eyes. He served, and he was adopted out to that man who did this to him, 2530. David. The officer who got bit, he ran the man's plates. He has a history of animal neglect charges. He beat that dog. Franklin, he beat a hero. Franklin stared at the papers. A cold, slow, burning anger began to replace the grief in his chest. He had seen this before. Mads were heroes on the field, but if they developed PTSD, if they washed out, they were sometimes discarded. Passed along until they broke. He looked at Wolf, who was watching them from the corner, still trembling. It wasn't just a dog. It wasn't just a reflection of Max. It was one of his own, the feeling of a fated connection, 2609, of responsibility he couldn't run from, settled on him like a physical weight. He wasn't just saving a dog, he was saving a fellow veteran. He handed the mug back to Meredith. Thank you, ma'am, for the coffee, and for this. He turned and walked to his truck. Meredith thought he was leaving his rigid shoulders a sign of defeat, but he didn't open the driver's door. He opened the passenger side from a small cooler on the floor. He pulled a foil-wrapped packet. He walked back to the kennel. Run Wolf tensed, expecting a threat. Franklin knelt, ignoring the filth on the concrete, 2646. He didn't throw the food. He didn't try to force it. He spoke in a low, calm tone. Guter Junge. Das ist für dich, good boy. This is for you. He slid the small packet, which contained high-value air-dried liver. He prepared himself just inside the gate. It sat there, a silent offering. Then he retreated. He picked up his stool, walked back to his spot, and opened his book. He gave the dog the dignity of distance. Wolf stared at the packet. He stared at Franklin. He looked at the packet again, his black nose twitching. He was clearly starving, but the fear was stronger, 2725. He paced whining, looking at the food, then at the man. The standoff lasted for 2 hours. Finally, the sun began to dip behind the shelter roof. It was time Franklin closed his book. He stood, put the stool by the wall, and walked to his truck. Not looking back the next morning, when Franklin arrived, the first thing he did was look at the run. The foil packet was gone. In its place were tiny torn shreds licked clean. Franklin nodded. Once he walked to the storage building, retrieved his stool, and sat. He pulled his book from his pocket, and from his other pocket, pulled a new foil packet, 2805, placing it on the ground beside him, waiting for 5 days. The new routine held. It was a fragile piece built on silence and liver treats. Franklin would arrive just after dawn. Wolf would be waiting no longer, exploding in panic, but standing tense at the back of his run, emitting a low, anxious whine that vibrated with unspoken trauma. Franklin would set his stool down. He had moved it. He was closer now, maybe 6 feet from the gate, and he had added a new crucial step. He would sit book in hand, and slowly over the course of an hour, he would extend his left hand and rest it palm out, 2845, against the chain link. He would not look at the dog, he just offered his scent. A stationary, non-threatening presence. Wolf's reaction was a war with himself. He would pace snuff and let out short, frustrated barks as if furious at his own inability to chase this calm man away. But every day his curiosity would win. He would creep closer, his belly low to the ground, until he was just on the other side of the fence. He would sniff the air near Franklin's hand, his black nose twitching before his own. Fear sent him skittering back to the corner. Franklin never moved. He just sat, 2923, his hand on the wire, a living statue of patience. Meredith watched this slow, painful ballet every morning from the office window, her heart caught between hope and despair. She had seen Franklin slide the morning's foil packet under the gate and seen Wolf wait only 10 minutes, not 2 hours before snatching it. When he thought Franklin was reading, it was progress. It was slow and agonizing, but it was real. On the morning of the 6th day, the peace was broken. The sound of a truck pulling into the gravel lot made Franklin look up. It was not Jared's quiet sedan, 3003. The crunch of the tires was heavy and aggressive. A county vehicle, its logo stark on the door, slammed to a halt. David got out. He wore his uniform, but his arm was bound in a heavy white bandage, the hand emerging swollen and blue. He held a clipboard in his good hand, clutching it to his chest like a shield. His face was pale, his eyes dark with a mixture of anger and a deep, unsettling fear. The moment Wolf saw him, the last 5 days were erased. The dog lunged, a furious, desperate explosion of gray and white. He hit the gate with a deafening rattle, his teeth bared, snarling and snapping at the man, 3043, who was the source of his pain. Both past and present, David flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk backward. That reflexive show of fear seemed to fuel his anger. "See," he shouted. Not to Franklin, but to the world at large, still a monster. I told you Jared emerged from the office." His face grim. He had clearly been expecting this. "David, calm down. You're agitating him. I'm agitating him." David's voice cracked. He held up the clipboard. "This is official, Jared. The report is filed aggression incident level. 4, mandatory, 3122. Our insurance carrier got the report yesterday." He jabbed a finger toward the snarling dog. "They're threatening to drop the whole county contract. Not just the shelter, the whole county. All because of that." Jared looked trapped. "David, we're making progress. This man's Franklin. He's a veteran handler. The dog is a former MWD. I don't care if he was a 4-star general." David shouted, his eyes wide. "He's a liability. The county board agrees." They held an emergency vote. He thrust the clipboard at Jared. "You have 7 days. That's the order, 3201. Franklin had stood up. The legs of his stool made a quiet scraping. Sound on the gravel, a sound that cut through the tense air. Wolf, hearing his protector move, fell silent, though his body was still coiled, trembling 7 days for what Franklin's voice was low, and it carried. David turned on him, his gaze sweeping over Franklin with contempt. 7 days until he's put down. That's the law, behavioral euthanasia, and I'll be the one to sign the paper. It's my right as the victim." He smiled, a thin, bitter expression that held no victory, only pain. He slapped the clipboard against Jared's chest. 32:45. My shift starts next Monday. I expect it to be done. He turned, got back in his truck, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust. Jared stared at the paper, his shoulders slumped. Franklin was staring at the kennel. Wolf had retreated to the corner, his failed charge leaving him panting and defeated. The weight of 15 years of Kandahar, of every failure, crashed down on Franklin. A timer, a 7-day deadline, a life he was responsible for slipping through his fingers. He had run from this, and it had found him. Anyway, Jared, Meredith said. Coming out of the office, 33:25, her face pale. He can't do that, can he? He just did, Jared said, his voice flat. He looked at Franklin. He's right. The county holds the purse strings. My hands are tied. It's a legal order, 7 days. Franklin said, his voice hollow. It's not enough time. It's not enough time to heal him. Wait, Meredith stepped forward, her own eyes scanning the official document in Jared's hand. She pointed to a subsection. Franklin, listen to me. Jared, look, it's not just a death warrant. She took the paper. The goal isn't to heal him. That's impossible. I read the fine print, 3406. She looked Franklin directly in the eye, her voice suddenly strong. The order is for euthanasia, unless he can be deemed manageable for transfer. We don't have to make him a pet. We just have to prove he can be controlled. Franklin's gaze sharpened. Controlled. Yes, Meredith said, a new frantic energy in her voice. He has to reliably accept a muzzle, and he has to walk on a leash without lunging from this kennel, run to a transport vehicle. That's the loophole. If we can film that, if we can document that, he is manageable, I can legally transfer him, 3444, to a specialized MWD sanctuary in Colorado. Jared looked up a spark of his old captain's mind, igniting the one outside Boulder. I've heard of it. They have specialists exactly, Meredith said. It's a long shot. He won't even let us near the gate with a bowl. Franklin looked at Wolf, the impossible abstract goal of healing. Vanished in its place was a concrete, tangible mission, muzzle leash walk. This he understood. This was a mission profile. Later that afternoon, the shelter was quiet. Franklin had not left. He was sitting on his stool, but his intensity was different, 35:26. He was no longer just waiting. He was planning inside the office. Meredith was pacing. I just don't understand David. How can he be so cruel? He hates that dog. Jared was at his desk staring at the wall, his face a map of exhaustion. He doesn't hate the dog. Meredith, he's terrified, and he has a right to be. Meredith stopped pacing. What do you mean about 5 years ago? Jared said, his voice low. Before I was director, David was the lead officer on a rescue, a salvable pit mix. The owner had sworn it was just scared. David went in the house. The dog got him, took him down. It wasn't a bite. It was a mauling, 3611. Meredith's hand went to her mouth. 60 stitches in his leg. Jared continued. 40 in his arm. Nerve damage. He was out of work for 8 months. Doctor said he'd never have full use of that hand again. He proved them wrong, but it took everything he had. Jared the dog. Jared said it was just scared, but scared dogs, abused dogs, they're the most dangerous. David came back to work. Everyone said he was a hero, but he's never been the same. He trusts rules, not instincts. He sees Wolf, and he doesn't see a veteran. He sees the animal that almost cost him his arm, his career. He sees a monster, 3652. Jared stood and walked to the window, looking out at the 2 figures in the late afternoon sun. What's happening out there? Meredith, it's not a man versus a dog. It's Franklin's trauma versus David's trauma, and I'm stuck in the middle. He has 7 days outside. Franklin slowly attached a worn black tactical muzzle to the end of a long, lightweight pole. He didn't try to touch Wolf. He simply held it out a few inches inside the gate, letting the dog sniff this new strange object before pulling it back. The clock was ticking. The shelter now operated on 2 clocks, the real one on the wall, 37:32, and the one Franklin carried in his gut, 6 days remaining. He had not gone home. The 90-minute round trip up and down the mountain was a luxury of time he could no longer afford. He slept in the cab of his truck, reclined against the worn bench seat, waking every few hours as the temperature dropped, his bones aching. The first thing he did when the sun touched the peaks was get his stool. He was intensifying the therapy. He moved the stool closer. He was 4 feet from the gate, now well within the dog's recognized boundary, 3806. Wolf's reaction to this was electric. The low growl was constant. He could not relax. He paced in tight, frantic circles, but he would not lunge. Franklin's calm was a shield. The dog's aggression could not penetrate. Then came the muzzle. Franklin had brought it on day 6, a black basket-style tactical muzzle, the kind used in MWD training. He had attached it to a simple wooden pole, not as a weapon, but as an extension, a tool for desensitization. He sat on his stool, his book unopened in his lap. He slowly, quietly pushed the pole through the chain link, the muzzle resting on the concrete. 3849. 6 inches inside, the run wolf's reaction was immediate. He scrambled to the back wall, his claws making a scraping noise on the floor. A high-pitched, terrified whine escaped his throat. He stared at the muzzle, his entire body trembling. This was the tool of his abuser. This was the precursor to pain. Franklin held it there. He said nothing. He just held it motionless for an hour. It was a battle of wills, but not of aggression. It was Franklin's patience versus the dog's trauma. By midday, Wolf's fear had exhausted him. 3926. He was still in the corner, but his head was down. He would watch the muzzle, then look at Franklin. Muzzle man, muzzle man. His traumatized brain was trying to connect. The muzzle was terror, but the man was liver treats. The man was the low, calm voice. The man was the first human who had not tried to hurt him. This was the conflict that Franklin had to win. He slowly pulled the muzzle back out the moment it vanished. The tension in Wolf's body eased by half. Then Franklin did the second hardest thing. He put his left hand bare against the chain link gate. 4009. Wolf watched him. He crept forward a few steps. He sniffed the air. He was close enough to smell the leather of Franklin's jacket, the scent of pine smoke from his clothes, the faint salty smell of his skin. The dog crept closer. He stretched his neck out, his black nose twitching just an inch from the wire. He was sniffing the hand. Franklin did not move. He did not breathe. Wolf's tongue, pink and tentative, darted out and licked the wire where Franklin's hand rested, then terrified by his own bravery. The dog scrambled back to the corner. Franklin let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. 4047. He stayed for another 2 hours, his hand on the gate, a silent promise. The day ended, 5 days remaining. The shelter emptied out. The volunteers left. Jared went home, giving Franklin a tired salute as he locked the front gate. Only Meredith stayed. She was in the clinic working late, catching up on paperwork that had piled up during the week's drama. The quiet hum of the building's fluorescent lights was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional sad bark from the main adoption wing. Around 9, she made a fresh pot of coffee, her movements heavy with fatigue. 41/27. She poured 2 mugs. She found Franklin where she knew he would be. He was still on his stool in the quarantine wing, the hallway lights casting long, grim shadows. He had his jacket on, the old brown leather one zipped up against the night's chill. He was not reading, he was just sitting, his hand resting on the gate of Wolf's run. And inside, Wolf was asleep. Not a true deep sleep, but the exhausted, fitful rest of a traumatized animal. He was lying 2 feet from the gate, his nose pointing toward Franklin's hand. Meredith approached slowly, her soft-soled shoes making almost no sound. 4208. He's asleep. She whispered, her voice full of wonder. Franklin turned his head, his face shadowed, just resting. He wakes if I move. She handed him one of the mugs. He took it, his cold fingers wrapping around the warmth. He held it, seeming to draw the heat into his hands. You should go home, Meredith said softly, leaning against the opposite wall. You look exhausted so. Do you? Franklin replied, his voice a low rumble. Meredith let out a short, bitter laugh. Yeah, well, it was a long day. It's always a long day. She took a sip of her own coffee. 4251. I had to euthanize 3 dogs this afternoon. Not for aggression, just for space. Too old, too sick, too unadoptable. We're full. We're always full. She looked down into her mug. Sometimes I wonder what we're even doing here. We save 1 and 5 more come in. I write reports, I give shots, I clean kennels, and then I hold them when they go. It just feels useless sometimes, like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. Her voice was thick with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. It was a burnout Franklin recognized. 4333. It was the exhaustion of the heart. Franklin looked at her. He saw her earnest, tired eyes, the faint smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was young, and she was carrying a weight that was too heavy for her. He looked at Wolf, sleeping fitfully by the gate. He looked at his own hand, the one the dog had almost trusted. "You're not alone," he said the words, surprising him. Meredith looked up in that feeling. He clarified his gaze, drifting to a point on the concrete floor. The uselessness. He was quiet for a long time, sipping the hot coffee, 4412. The only sound was the buzz of the lights. "I had a partner," Franklin said, his voice so low Meredith had to lean in. "Max, he was not like other dogs. He was smarter, he was better." He smiled, a faint sad twisting of his lips under the beard. He could track a target across 3 clicks of hardpan desert in a sandstorm. He loved the work. He loved me, and I loved him more than most people. I think Meredith's eyes softened. "He was your K9 in the war. He was my K9. Franklin nodded. "He was my best friend. He saved my life more than once." 4455. "I owed him everything." The silence stretched again. Franklin's hand, the one not holding the mug, clenched into a fist. He stared at it as if seeing something on his knuckles. When it happened, the reports, they said it was unavoidable. An IED, just bad luck, the kind of thing that happens over there. He took a shaky breath. The night air of the shelter suddenly felt like the thin, hot air of Kandahar. "But they don't know," he whispered. "They weren't there. They weren't in my head." He looked up, and for the first time Meredith saw the raw 15-year-old pain he kept hidden. 4536. His eyes were bright, the hard lines of his face broken by a vulnerability that was terrible to see. "It was avoidable," he said, his voice cracking. "I was tired. We were pushing a 20-hour up the heat. It was over 120. Max alerted and he gave me the sign, a subtle one. But I knew he told me something was wrong." He looked down, squeezing his eyes shut. "But I hesitated. A part of me thought maybe he's just hot. Maybe he's tired." I second-guessed him. I second-guessed Max, Franklin. Meredith whispered, her heart breaking. "I should have pulled back. I should have called EOD. But I didn't." 4622. His voice was choked. "I gave a bad command. I told him to check. I sent him forward just a few more feet. I sent him to his death." He opened his eyes, the guilt of 15 years pouring out. "I got him killed. Meredith, I gave a bad command and I got my partner killed. That's the truth. I'm the one. I'm the one who's broken. Not this dog. Me." He turned away from her. His shoulders slumped as he stared into the kennel at the sleeping dog. A veteran defined not by his service, but by the one terrible mistake he could never outrun. 4701. Meredith sat with him in the cold, quiet hallway for a long time. The weight of his confession hung in the air. A 15-year-old specter, given new life, she didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't say it wasn't your fault. She, better than anyone, understood the crushing burden of responsibility, the what-ifs that haunted a life spent around animals. Finally, she stood, taking his empty mug. "Franklin," she said softly, "you're not that man anymore, and you're the only one who can save this dog. Don't let your past kill him too." 4737. She left him alone with the sleeping shepherd. Her words, intended as comfort, felt like a judgment. "Don't let your past kill him too." He stared at Wolf. The 7-day clock was ticking, 4 days remaining. He was trying to build trust with a traumatized animal, a veteran. But what was he building it on? A lie? He was projecting his own failure onto Wolf, seeing Max's ghost in every flicker of the dog's ears. He wasn't saving Wolf. He was trying to save himself. He realized with a cold, sickening dread that he couldn't. He couldn't teach Wolf to trust the world when he couldn't even trust his own memory. 4821. The confession to Meredith hadn't freed him. It had only shown him the depth of his prison. He needed to know he needed. He didn't know what he needed: confirmation's absolution. He had to face the truth, the real truth, not just the story. He had told himself for 15 years. He stood up, his joints protesting. The cold Wolf's head lifted instantly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Easy," Franklin murmured, his voice thick, easy. "I'll be back." He walked out of the quarantine wing, past the empty reception desk, and into the sharp 4858, cold New Mexico. Night. The moon was a sliver, the stars brilliant in the black sky. He drove. He didn't go to his truck to sleep. He started the engine, the sound loud in the silent lot, and pulled onto the highway. He drove past the feed store, past the sleeping town square. He drove to the only place in town that was open all night, the 24-hour gas station on the interstate junction. It was an island of harsh fluorescent light. He parked by the air pump, away from the main building. He walked past the rows of snacks and sodas to the back, where an old battered payphone hung on the wall, 4939. He hadn't made a call from one of these in. He couldn't remember. He pulled his wallet from his back pocket. It was old. The leather crack tucked behind a flap of fabric was a tiny faded folded piece of paper. He hadn't looked at it since 2005. It had one name and one number on it. James. His fingers were stiff, clumsy with cold and a sudden paralyzing fear. He fumbled a coin, heard it drop and rattle on the floor. He left it, he pulled out another. His hand shaking, he inserted the coin, lifted the heavy cold receiver and punched in the numbers. The sound of the call connecting was unnaturally loud. 5021, a mechanical click, a pause, and then a long distant ringing. Once, twice on the third ring, a voice answered thick and rough with sleep. "Yeah, who is this?" Franklin's throat was dry. He leaned his forehead against the cold metal of the phone enclosure. "James, it's Franklin Hayes." The silence on the other end was absolute. It stretched for 5 seconds, then 10. Franklin could hear the faint electric hum of the open line. He could hear the hum of the gas station's freezers behind him when James spoke again. 51. Yo. His voice was completely different. It was not sleepy. It was cold, sharp, and wide awake. "Franklin," the name was an accusation, "after 15 years. You're alive? Why are you calling me? James, I just needed to..." "You needed what?" The anger held back for a decade and a half, exploded through the receiver. "You vanished, man. Just gone. No funeral, no wake, not a word. We thought you were dead. We thought we didn't know what to think. Why are you calling me now? At 3 in the morning, Franklin deserved this." He took a steadying breath. 5143. "You're right. I'm sorry, James. I couldn't, you couldn't. What about the rest of us, Frank? What about the guys who had to carry his box? What about me? I'm calling about Max." Franklin forced the words out, his voice a low rasp. Another pause. The anger in James's voice cracked, replaced by a sudden weary grief. "Max, what about him?" "I need to say it," Franklin said, squeezing his eyes shut. I need you to know it was my fault, James. I hesitated. I sent him. I gave a bad command. I got him killed." He braced for the confirmation for James to finally agree to give voice to the guilt, 52-29, that had been his only companion for 15 years. Instead, there was a strange choking sound. It wasn't agreement. It was disbelief. What are you talking about?" James said. "Bad command." I hesitated. Franklin repeated, his voice breaking. "I should have pulled back. I was tired. I sent him forward. I killed him. Is that what you've been telling yourself?" James's voice was rising sharp with a new frantic energy. "For 15 years. Is that why you disappeared? You think it was your fault?" "It's the truth," Franklin whispered. 5309. No, the word was a shout, a denial of Franklin's entire reality. "No, that's not what happened. Are you crazy? You think it was your fault?" Franklin was stunned, his mind reeling. "I saw it. The explosion. You saw nothing." James was almost sobbing now, a raw, painful sound. "You were tired. We were all tired. But Max was perfect. He alerted you, called it. You were right. But the IED, it wasn't where he alerted. It was a decoy. Frank, a setup, a trap for the EOD team." Franklin leaned his head against the cold metal, the world tilting what it was, a secondary. 5355. James said, his voice thick and wet. "A pressure plate aimed at us. Max alerted on the first one. The decoy, but then he smelled the second one. He knew. It was for us? No, yes, he didn't move forward because of your command. Frank, he moved because I did." James's voice broke. "I stepped off the line. I was moving toward the decoy, and Max, he lunged, he hit me, he tackled me, knocked me off the plate. He took the whole blast himself. He saved me." Frank, the receiver, was shaking in Franklin's hand. "He died saving me." James wept. 5435. "Not you, me. I was the one he was covering. I was the one who made the mistake. The gas station, the phone, the cold night, it all dissolved. Franklin was hit by a truth so profound it almost buckled his knees. 15 years of self-imposed exile, of silence, of running from a failure that was never his. His guilt wasn't wrong, it was just misplaced. He wasn't guilty of a bad command. He was guilty of vanishing. He was guilty of leaving James, his teammate, to carry this story. The true story alone for 15 years. James Franklin said, his voice hollow, unrecognizable. I, 5519. I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Yeah, James said, his voice raw and spent. That's because you ran Frank, and you left the rest of us to deal with it, to deal with him being a hero. All by ourselves. The line was quiet. Franklin could hear James taking a long, shuddering breath. I'm glad you're not dead, man, James said finally. I really am, but I gotta go. A soft click, and the line went dead. Franklin stood in the harsh buzzing light of the gas station. The dead receiver in his hand, he hadn't been set free. He's just been handed a different 5602 heavier set of chains. He wasn't a failure, he was a coward. He slowly hung up the phone. He looked at his hands. He'd been trying to save Wolf from a ghost, from a mistake that had never happened. He turned and walked out into the cold dark. He got in his truck. He had to go back. Not to save Wolf from his past, but to save them both from the present. The drive back from the gas station was a blur. The dark highway unspooled in front of his headlights. But Franklin was seeing a sun-blasted road in Kandahar. He was not unburdened. He was rearranged. The crushing, suffocating guilt of failure, 5640, the one that had defined him for 15 years, the one that had been his only companion on the mountain, was gone. He had not given a bad command. He had not hesitated. In its place was a different, sharper grief. The grief of cowardice. Max hadn't just died, he had sacrificed himself. He had died a hero, saving James, saving the team, and Franklin had not stayed to honor him. He hadn't stood by his teammates. He had taken his grief, wrapped it in a lie, and vanished. He had abandoned James to carry the truth of that day alone. He had let Max's legacy rot, 5717, defined by a mistake that never even happened. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He understood now. He wasn't just trying to save a traumatized dog from a 7-day deadline. He was trying to atone for abandoning a hero. He arrived at the shelter as the first thin light of dawn painted the eastern sky. Purple, the lot was empty. He had 3 days left. He walked with a new heavy purpose to the quarantine wing. He heard Wolf stir before he saw him, a low warning growl, the sound of an animal bracing for the day's inevitable stress. 5754. Franklin stopped at the key hook by the door. Jared had given him a key after the 7-day order. He unhooked it. He did not get his stool. He did not get his book. He walked to the gate of Wolf's Run. The dog scrambled to his feet, instantly alert. When Franklin did not stop, did not sit. Wolf's growled intensified. He lunged at the gate, hitting it with his front paws, a rattling metallic sound of warning. Stay back. Franklin ignored it. He put the key in the heavy padlock. The sound of the lock clicking open was unnaturally loud in the concrete hallway. 5832. Wolf exploded. He launched himself at the gate, barking a deep, frantic, terrifying sound. He was snapping his teeth, clacking against the chain link, his eyes white with panic. I will kill you if you come in here. Franklin took a deep breath. He did not smell the bleach of the shelter. He smelled the dust of Afghanistan. He was no longer afraid of his past. He was just tired of running from it. He slid the bolts, opened the gate just enough to slip inside, and latched it shut behind him. The click of the latch was like a gunshot. Wolf screamed. It was not a bark. 5908. It was a high-pitched, terrified, desperate sound as he scrambled backward, crashing into the far concrete wall. He was cornered. He was trapped. He snarled, his lips pulled back, his body trembling so hard Franklin could see it from 10 feet away. Franklin did not move. He just stood his back to the gate, giving the dog the entire run. He did not make himself small. He did not look away. He just stood, a man who had finally stopped running. The dog's frantic snarls filled the air. But through the panic, Wolf was seeing this man for the first time. This was not the man who sat on the stool, 5947. That man was tense, coiled, haunted by something Wolf could smell: guilt, fear, hesitation. That man was a threat because he was unpredictable, this man. This man was different. He was heavy. He was sad. But the fear was gone. The restless, guilty energy was gone. This man was solid. He was an anchor and Wolf, in his ocean of terror, had no idea what to do with him. The snarling faltered. It became a low, confused growl. The dog's ears were still pinned, but his head was high. Watching, processing. Franklin, moving slowly, lowered himself. He did not squat like a handler ready to spring. Waspast and wand, or 30. He sank to his knees, a position of total vulnerability, rested his hands on his thighs. He looked at the dog, and Wolf looked back. He was a hero. Franklin whispered his voice. Rough. Wolf's head tilted. The growling stopped, replaced by an anxious, high-pitched whine. His name was Max. Franklin said the words for himself, not the dog. He wasn't a failure. He was a hero. And I left him. I ran away. He was not confessing to Wolf. He was confessing in front of him. He was laying his broken, rearranged soul bare on the cold concrete at 1:01:08. He was a handler with no handler's tricks left. He was just a man finally telling the truth. Wolf's entire body seemed to deflate. The terror that held him, rigid, was being met by a profound, exhausted calm. The man was not a threat. The man was broken like him. The dog took one hesitant step, then another. He moved slowly, his belly low, his paws silent on the concrete. He stopped just out of Franklin's reach, his black nose twitching, sniffing the air. Reading the story on him, he smelled the salt of shed tears, the adrenaline of a 15-year-old truth. Franklin didn't move. He didn't offer a hand. 150. He just waited. Wolf took the last step. He stretched his long gray neck forward, and then, in a gesture of profound, unspoken trust, he pressed his head hard against Franklin's chest. He didn't nudge. He didn't lick. He just pushed, as if trying to hold Franklin up, or perhaps to hold himself up. He was anchoring himself to the only solid thing in his world. Franklin's breath hitched. He closed his eyes slowly. He raised his hands. He did not pet the dog. He cupped the shepherd's broad head, his fingers sinking into the thick ruff, and he held him. 1:02:29 for the first time since 2005. Franklin Hayes wept. He wept for Max's sacrifice. He wept for James's loneliness. He wept for the 15 years he had lost to a lie. He held the traumatized, trembling dog, and the dog held him back, and in the cold, quiet hallway of the county shelter, two veterans, two broken soldiers began to heal. They stayed that way for a long time, a silent monument of shared scars. That night, everything changed. The day had been a triumph by evening. Franklin had, with painstaking slowness, introduced the muzzle. Wolf hated it. He had recoiled, but he had allowed it. R1:03:10. He had associated it with Franklin's calm presence by 4 estares. He had even taken a few steps on a leash inside the run. Meredith had watched, crying silently. "We have it, Franklin," she said, her voice bright with hope. "We can film it tomorrow. We'll beat the deadline." Franklin had felt something he hadn't felt in a decade and a half. A flicker of peace. He decided to drive home to his cabin for a real night's sleep. The first in a week, he would be back at dawn. The drive up the mountain was strange. The air was heavy, thick, and an oppressive yellowish-green color. There was no wind. It was the kind of deep 1:03:53 unnatural stillness that comes before a violent break. He was in his cabin heating a can of soup when the sky broke open. It was not a gentle rumble. It was a sharp, concussive crack that shook the cabins, windows in their frames. It sounded exactly like incoming artillery. Franklin dropped the metal spoon. It clattered loudly on the floor. He didn't flinch. He vanished. He was instantly on the floor, his back against the wall, his head covered, his body braced for the shock wave incoming. He was not in New Mexico. He was in Kandahar, the air tasting of dust and ozone, 1:31 miles away in the shelter. The same sound, the concrete walls of the quarantine wing, built like a bunker, amplified the sound, made it echo. Wolf had been asleep. The sound hit him, and he was instantly awake. He wasn't in a kennel. He was in a war zone. He scrambled to his feet, screaming. It was a high, thin, terrible sound, the sound of an animal in pure blind panic. Another sharp crack of thunder. This one, even louder, rattled the building. Wolf threw himself against his kennel door. It was the same door he had hit for days. the one whose latch was already stressed and damaged, 105-8. He hit it twice, a 90-pound missile of pure terror on the third impact. The metal latch, which had only been temporarily secured by Jared after the initial break, finally gave way. The metal shrieked at the gate burst open. Wolf was out. He didn't pause. He didn't look. He was a gray and white streak driven by a PTSD trigger, so profound he was no longer a dog, but a nerve. He ran down the dark hallway past the empty reception desk and hit the front door. It was locked. He spun, ran toward the clinic, and found a cat. Flap a large one for passing supplies. 105-47. He clawed his way through it, tumbling out into the night. He ran into the full, furious chaos of the storm. The rain was a solid wall of water. The thunder was a constant rolling explosion. He was not running anywhere. He was running from the war. The dawn after the storm was unnaturally clear. The sky washed a pale, clean blue, but the ground was chaos. The wind had torn through the valley, leaving a trail of debris, shattered branches, and overturned trash cans. David arrived at the shelter for his shift at 7 a.m. It was his first day back, 1:06:23, since the mandatory leave for his injury, and he had come prepared, his hand in a new lighter bandage he was carrying, the official 7-day notice now. With only 2 days left on it, he was ready to finalize this. He saw the damage to the quarantine wing before he even got out of his truck. The kennel gate for Wolf was not just unlatched, it was hanging crookedly on one hinge. The metal bent outward. The concrete floor of the run was slick with muddy paw prints. David's breath caught. He did not feel anger. First, he felt a cold, prickling dread that started at the base of his neck. 107 discs. His old trauma. The memory of the mauling 5 years ago flared instantly. That dog had also been quiet, manageable until it wasn't. No, he whispered. He followed the paw prints, his good hand, resting on the tactical flashlight on his belt. The prints LED down the hall to the clinic. He saw the cat flap. It was broken shards of plastic scattered on the floor. It was out the monster, the liability. The ticking time bomb he had warned them all about was loose in the community. It was loose near the school, near the livestock. He scrambled back to his truck, 107:38, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't call Jared. He didn't call Meredith. He keyed his county radio dispatch. This is David 14. I have a 1031. He used the code for an animal-related emergency aggressive level. 4. Shepherd MWD escaped house. County shelter, he is loose dangerous. And a high-risk public threat. I am initiating containment protocols. He paused, his voice shaking, and I am armed. He didn't wait for a reply. He started his truck and headed for the foothills. He knew, just as Franklin knew, where a scared animal would run the phone in Franklin's cabin was a violation. In 1821. It was an old landline, and its shrill mechanical ringing was a sound he hadn't heard in months. He had just woken up stiff and sore. The adrenaline from his thunderstorm induced flashback, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He picked it up, his voice, a rough growl. Yeah. Franklin Meredith's voice was high-pitched, frantic, and shattering. He's gone, he's gone. Franklin was instantly awake. Meredith, slow down. Who is gone? Wolf, the storm. Oh, Franklin. The storm. Last night. The thunder. It must have terrified him. He broke the kennel door. He's gone. Franklin was already pulling on his boots. 1-1-04. Where's Jared? I don't know. I just got here, but David's truck is gone, and he's not answering his radio. He's Franklin. He's hunting him. I know he is. He's going to kill him. Franklin closed his eyes. The hard truth from James, still fresh, he died, saving me. And now another veteran was being hunted because he was scared. Where would he go? Franklin, she pleaded up. Franklin said he grabbed his old brown leather jacket. He'll go high away from the noise. He'll look for a defensible position. He knew exactly where the old mining operation, 109-44, abandoned since the 1970s. A maze of rocks and caves meet me at the base of the old Sonora Mine Trail. He didn't hang up. He just dropped the receiver onto its cradle and was out the door. He drove his truck down the mountain with a controlled speed that was almost reckless. He wasn't just a man on a rescue. He was a canine handler on a mission. He saw them at the trailhead, two White County trucks parked at odd angles, and Meredith's small sedan parked haphazardly as if she had slammed on the brakes and jumped out. 1 Waten 18. David was there, and he was not alone. He had two other younger officers with him, both looking nervous. David was not nervous. He was rigid with his own fear, which had manifested as cold, terrible certainty. He had a county-issued rifle unslung, holding it at a low-ready position. Meredith was standing in front of him, her arms outstretched, tears streaming down her face. "David, you don't have the authority. Jared hasn't signed off on this. I don't need his signature," David said, his voice flat. "This is an active public threat. 11056. That thing mauled me and now it's loose. I have every authority. Now get out of my way. Meredith, this is not your concern. He's not a thing. He's a veteran. He's just scared. So am I," David shouted, his control finally breaking. "So am I, and I'm not letting what happened to me happen to some kid walking to school. Now move." He shoved past her, his shoulder knocking her off balance. He chambered around the metallic sound of the action. A sharp slide and click was horribly final. "Put it down." David Franklin's voice cut through the cold morning air. 11134. It was not loud, but it had the authority of a man who had spent his life giving commands that could not be questioned. David spun around. Franklin stepped out of his truck. He was a tall, lean figure against the bright morning light. He wore the old unzipped brown leather jacket, the collar of his red and navy plaid shirt, visible underneath his face, framed by the gray-streaked beard, was carved from stone. He walked slowly, deliberately toward the group. He stopped about 15 feet from David. "I said," Franklin repeated, his voice dangerously quiet, "put the rifle down. You stay out of this, old man." 112-15. David said, his knuckles white on the rifle, "You're the one who agitated him. This is on you. I'm finishing it. He's not a threat." Franklin said, "He's a soldier. He's trapped. He's calling for help." "That's not help. He's calling for." David sneered his fear, making him cruel. "That's how they sound before they rip your arm open. I know that sound. Then you should know the sound of a man who's giving you a lawful order." A new voice boomed a dark sedan. An old police interceptor model had pulled up, blocking the trail completely. 11251. Jared got out. He was not the tired, slumped shelter director. He was wearing an old dark windbreaker with the faded letters Taos PD Redigers on the breast. He stood tall, his old police captain's authority radiating from him like a physical force. He walked directly between Franklin and David. He looked at David, his gaze flat and hard as iron. "David, I know what you're thinking," Jared said, his voice a command. "I know what you're remembering, but this is not that day, and this is not that dog. You are emotionally compromised. Give me the rifle, Jared. I have the authority. A1-1331. No, you don't." Jared snapped, and the other two officers took a step back. "You have a recommendation. I am the director of this facility. That dog is shelter property, and he is under my jurisdiction until that 24-hour deadline expires, or until I sign the paper, and I haven't signed it." He pointed a finger at David's chest. "You're hunting my property. You're threatening a civilian." He gestured to Franklin. "And you are standing down. That is a direct order." The standoff was absolute. David's face was pale, his breathing ragged. He was at war with his own trauma, and he was losing slowly with a shaking hand. 1-12. He lowered the rifle. Jared did not relax. He turned his back on David, a calculated gesture of dominance, and faced Franklin. He looked at the mountain, then at the man. "You were right," Jared said, his voice softer now about everything. "I was so busy managing the rules, I forgot to manage the problem." He nodded to Franklin. "You were inspired to help him. And frankly, Franklin, watching you inspired me." He stepped aside. "You know where he is, don't you?" "I know where he'll be hiding," Franklin said. "Go get him," Jared said. He turned back to David. 1-14-53. "We will be here. We will secure the perimeter. But no one goes up that trail. No one." He looked at his watch. "The deadline, it's noon tomorrow. But I'm giving you 24 hours from right now. Go get your soldier, Franklin. Looked at Meredith, who was sobbing with relief. He looked at Jared, who gave him a sharp, respectful nod. He looked at David, who was staring at the ground, defeated by his own fear. Franklin turned away from all of them. He faced the mountain, his mountain, and began to climb. Franklin left, the noise behind, the shouting, the trucks. 1-15-32. the fear of David, and the weary responsibility of Jared. It all faded the moment he stepped onto the trail. This was his world. The high desert air was clean. Washed by the storm, he moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in 15 years. He was no longer the recluse. He was the handler. He climbed his boots, finding purchase on the slick, wet rock. He was in his 50s, but he moved with the economical grace of a man who understood the mountain. He wasn't just walking, he was tracking. The signs were easy to read, too easy. The paw prints in the damp, 1/16/11. Red earth were deep, disorganized, showing the splayed toes of an animal running in blind panic. He saw where Wolf had slipped the scramble marks in the amud, the splinters of a branch he had snapped. This wasn't a runaway. This was a retreat. Franklin knew exactly where the trail led. He too had sought defensible spaces. The Sonora mine hadn't been operational since the 1970s. It was a scar on the mountainside, a dangerous maze of abandoned equipment, loose shale, and dark, tempting holes. It was the perfect fortress for a terrified, wounded soldier. It was a foxhole, 1/16/51. He crested the last ridge, his breathing steady. His eyes scanning the area, was silent. The only sound was the wind moving through the pinyon pines. "Wolf," he called. His voice was not a command. It was a low, calm murmur, barely louder than the wind. "It's been here. I am here." He was met with silence. He knew the dog was here. The panic had likely exhausted him. He moved toward the main processing area, a flat expanse of rock littered with rusted metal. "Easy, soldier," he said. Speaking to the air, "We're just talking." Then he heard it. It was not a bark. It was a low, rattling growl, so deep it sounded like an engine idling, 1/17/36. It was desperate, and it was coming from below. Franklin followed the sound. He stopped at the edge of a deep, narrow fissure in the rock. It was a collapsed mine entrance, a dark vertical scar about 8 feet wide and 20 feet deep. He looked down. A pair of amber eyes, wild with terror, stared back up at him from the shadows. Wolf, he was wedged at the bottom. He must have been running in the dark, panicked by the storm, and tumbled in. He was trying to stand, but his back right leg was splayed at an unnatural angle, held fast by a tangle of old rebar and loose rock. 1/18/14. He was trapped when he saw Franklin looking down. Wolf lunged as much as he could. He snapped at the air, his teeth clacking, his body trembling with a furious, terrified growl. He was cornered, injured, and prepared to fight to the death. Franklin's heart ached. He didn't see a monster. He saw the end of a soldier's road. He unzipped his old brown leather jacket, the plaid of his shirt visible underneath. He needed to get down there, but going down the way Wolf had a straight drop was impossible. He skirted the edge of the ravine, his eyes searching 20 yards down the rock-sloped 1/18/53. It was a steep, treacherous slide of loose shale and gravel, but it led to a narrow ledge about 5 feet above where Wolf was trapped. It was the only way. Franklin sat on the edge, dug his heels in, and began to slide the sound of the rock. A loud, abrasive scraping sent Wolf into another fit of panic. Franklin slid faster than he intended. The gravel tearing at the palms of his hands and the tough hide of his jacket, he hit the ledge hard, knocking the wind out of himself. He winced, his hands stinging. Wolf was going frantic, snapping at the rock wall, at his own trapped leg, at the new threat. 1/19/30. That had just joined him in his prison. "Easy," Franklin panted, his voice a low rasp. "Easy? I'm not here to hurt you." He did not approach. He sat on the ledge, his legs dangling just 5 feet above the terrified dog. He stayed there, his back against the cold stone, and he just sat. He let the silence stretch. He let Wolf's panic burn itself out. The dog snarled, barked, and eventually, exhausted, subsided into a continuous, low, desperate growl. Franklin looked at his left hand. The slide had torn the palm open. It was bleeding freely, a dark, steady drip onto the rock. He reached into his jacket pocket. 1/20/16. A K9 handler was always prepared. He pulled out a small canvas first aid kit. Wolf watched him, his head-low eyes tracking every move. Franklin opened the kit. He pulled out a cleansing wipe and hissed as the antiseptic bit into the raw wound. He began to slowly and methodically bandage his own hand. He was a hero. Franklin said, his voice quiet, echoing slightly in the ravine. Wolf's growl faltered, his ears twitching at the sound. "Max, my partner," Franklin said. Wrapping the gauze, I told Meredith I got him killed. I told myself that for 15 years, 1/20/57, I hid on that mountain, Wolf. I hid from that lie because I thought it was the truth. He secured the bandage. He looked at his own wrapped hand, then down at the dog. But it wasn't the truth. The truth. The truth is harder. He was a hero. He saw a trap. A secondary device aimed at us, at me, and at my friend. And he didn't hesitate. He took it. He took the whole blast. He died, saving us. Wolf was whining a high-pitched, anxious sound. He was listening. And I ran. Franklin said, his voice thick with a shame he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now. I ran away from his memory, 121:39. I ran away from my team. I left my friend James to carry that story all by himself. I've been trapped, wolf-trapped under that cowardice for 15 years. He looked down at the shepherd whose leg was trapped under rusted metal. We've both been trapped, haven't we? Soldier me by a lie. You bay by whatever those men did to you. By the thunder, by this hole. He took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling his lungs. But today, we get out. Both of us. Franklin stood up on the narrow ledge. He unbuckled his thick leather belt. The one he'd worn for 20 years, he slid it free from the loops of his jeans. 1:22:23. He looked down. I'm coming down, Platts, down. Wolf, hearing the command, instinctively lowered his head, his body trembling. Franklin carefully lowered himself off the ledge, dropping the last 5 feet to the floor of the ravine. Landing lightly, Wolf snarled a reflex, but he didn't lunge. He was too weak, too scared, and perhaps too curious. Easy, easy, Franklin murmured. He didn't approach the snarling mouth. He approached the trapped leg. I see the problem. We'll fix it. He moved slowly, like a man defusing a bomb. He looped his belt, feeding the buckle through the end, creating a large temporary slip lead. 1:23:10. He held it out. Okay, this is just a tool. This is just a help. He slid it slowly over Wolf's head and onto his thick neck. Wolf flinched but allowed it. He was too tired to fight. Good boy, Franklin whispered. Guter Junge. He tightened it just enough to be a lead, not a choke. He looked at the trapped leg. The rebar was twisted, but the rock was loose. Franklin grabbed the largest piece of rock and with a grunt hauled it free. Wolf yelped a sharp, painful sound as the pressure released. He was free, but he was lame. He tried to stand, but his back leg wouldn't hold his weight. 1:23:54. I know, Franklin said. I know it hurts. He looked around the way he'd come. It was impossible to climb back up, especially with an injured dog. But at the far end of the ravine, 20 yards away, the rockfall had created a steep, narrow, sloping path. It was a goat path, almost vertical, but it was a way out. This is the hard part, Franklin said. He tugged the belt gently. We have to climb. I'm with you. We go together. He began to climb, scrambling up the first few feet of loose rock. He looked back. Wolf was standing on 3 legs, whining, terrified of being left, but terrified of moving. 1:24:36. Franklin went back down. He put his hand on Wolf's broad head. You are a soldier. You are a hero. You will not die in this hole. He gave the command not with anger, but with the deep, unwavering certainty of a handler. Up, come up. Wolf looked at him. He saw the path. He saw the man, and he chose with a painful whimper. He put his front paws on the first rock. He scrambled his injured leg, dragging uselessly again. Franklin commanded, moving just ahead of him, using the belt as a guide, not a leash. Up, it was an agonizing, desperate climb. Wolf was 90 pounds of dead weight and adrenaline. But to 25, up by 19. Franklin was scrambling, pulling his own body. Aching, they slipped, rocks tumbled down. Wolf cried out as his leg hit the stone, but he kept climbing. He was following the command. He was trusting the voice. They were a mess of dirt, blood, and sweat. Franklin was hauling. Wolf was scrambling. Both of them moving as one, a single unit of desperation and trust. Franklin grabbed the final edge, hauling himself over the top. He turned, braced his feet, and pulled one more up. Wolf gave a final desperate lunge and collapsed on the flat, solid ground of the trailhead. 1:9:25 by 58, his sides heaving, his mouth open, panting. He was out, he was free. Franklin unclipped his belt and collapsed next to the dog, his back against a boulder. He was panting, his hand bleeding again through the bandage, his leather jacket torn. Wolf, still whining from the pain in his leg, crawled the last 2 feet and put his head in Franklin's lap. He began to lick the blood off Franklin's torn hand. Franklin just sat there looking up at the clean blue sky and let him. The walk down was a slow, agonizing process. Franklin had used his own leather belt as a temporary leash and harness, looping it under Wolf's chest, one beyond 2638, to help support his weight. The shepherd, exhausted and in pain, leaned heavily against Franklin's leg, but he moved one limping, painful step at a time. He did not pull, he did not fight. The frantic, terrified animal that had fled into the storm was gone. In its place was a soldier, wounded but resolute, who had chosen his leader for Franklin. Every step down the mountain was the inversion of the life he had built. For 15 years, he had climbed up to escape. Now he was climbing down, supporting the weight of another, and walking back into the world he had abandoned, 1:27:15, when they emerged from the pinyon trees onto the flat gravel trailhead. The group was still there. It was as if they were frozen in time, a tableau of the standoff. Meredith was the first to see them. She had been pacing, wringing her hands, and stopped mid-stride. A sound, half sob, half gasp escaped her. Franklin Jared spun around his professional mask, slipping in a wave of profound relief. Even the two younger officers who had been leaning against their truck stood up straight. They were a hard sight. Franklin caked in mud and his own drying blood from his hand, 1:27:54. His plaid shirt and leather jacket torn, his face grim with exhaustion, and Wolf a gray and white ghost. His fur matted, his back leg held completely off the ground, but his head high. His gaze fixed on Franklin, trusting the tension returned, but it was different. It was focused on one man. David, he had been standing apart, his rifle now slung over his shoulder, his face pale and unreadable. He watched them approach, his eyes, not on Franklin, but on the dog. He saw the limp. He saw the pain, and he saw what no one had ever seen. He saw Wolf walking calmly on a slack lead, 1:28:36. His entire being focused on the man beside him. The dog was not a monster. He was just a dog, a broken one. Meredith started to run forward. "Oh, Franklin, his leg easy," Franklin said, his voice low, holding up his bandaged hand. "He's okay, he's calm, let's keep him that way." David was the one who moved. He didn't speak. He turned, walked stiffly to his county truck, and opened the large side panel toolbox. He pulled out a heavy, bright orange professional medical kit. He walked toward them, and Meredith flinched, stopping in her tracks. Franklin stood still, placing his body slightly in front of Wolf, 1:29:22. David did not stop until he was 10 feet away. He didn't try to get closer. He looked at Franklin, his gaze hard, but the manic fear was gone. He was all business, his trauma replaced by procedure. He placed the large kit on the gravel between them. "That leg needs stitches." "Now," David said, his voice clipped and professional. "He'll have nerve damage if that's not cleaned and splinted. My kit has everything." He looked at the dog one last time, then at Franklin. A look of profound, exhausted confusion. He said nothing else. He just turned, stepped back, and retreated to his truck, 1:30:02, leaning against the door. His part in this, finally over, it was his concession. Jared moved in, taking charge. "Meredith, you and I, let's get him to the clinic." Gently, Franklin knelt. Wolf, whining, licked his face. "It's okay, soldier," Franklin whispered. "These are friends, you're safe." He unclipped his belt from Wolf's neck and handed the shepherd over. He watched them with a gentleness he hadn't known was possible. Lift the 90-pound shepherd into a transport carrier. He watched his new fragile purpose being driven away to the clinic. He was left standing alone at the trailhead, 1:30:44, covered in blood and dirt, suddenly terribly unsure of what came next. Franklin Jared was standing beside him. He had a small first aid kit from his car. "Your hand," he said. Holding it out, Franklin looked at his own torn bandaged palm. He had forgotten. He nodded, and Jared began to awkwardly but efficiently clean and redress the wound. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," Franklin Jared said, quietly taping the gauze. "And I don't mean the climb. I mean what you did for David." Franklin looked over at David, who was still staring at the ground. "He's trapped, same as the dog, 1:31:28. "Yeah," Jared said. He finished the bandage. "You have a way of seeing that, don't you?" Jared capped the antiseptic. He looked at Franklin, at the old leather jacket and the plaid shirt, the uniform of a man who didn't belong anywhere. "There's a cottage," Jared said, gesturing toward the back of the shelter property, where a small, run-down stucco building sat under a cottonwood tree. "It's been empty for years. Used to be for the groundskeeper. The plumbing works mostly, roof's good." Franklin just looked at him, not understanding. 1:32 safe. It's not much, Jared continued, but it's quiet. It's here and it's yours. If you want it. Jared, I can't pay. I'm not talking about rent. Jared's voice was serious. Meredith, she's got a list. 3 other dogs in the back, a hound that won't let anyone touch it. A shepherd mix that. Came from a fighting ring. Dogs I was saving for a miracle dogs. I was hiding from David. He looked Franklin in the eyes. I think you're the miracle, Franklin. The cottage is yours. The job, if you want it, is to just keep doing what you're doing. Help me help them. 1:32:46. Franklin looked at the small cottage. He looked at the clinic where he could hear Meredith's low, soothing voice. He thought of his cold, silent cabin on the mountain, a 15-year prison he had built for himself. He had run to that mountain to escape his past. But his past. Max's heroism. James's grief. It wasn't something to escape, it was something to honor. He turned to Jared. I'll need to get my things, he said. Months later, the first snow of the season had dusted the valley. The small stucco cottage was no longer run down. 1:33:20. The broken fence was mended. A new, secure 6-foot fence surrounded the small yard. A thin curl of wood smoke rose from the chimney on the porch. Wolf lay sleeping in a patch of winter sun. He was magnificent. His gray and white coat was thick and clean. His back leg had healed. It left him with a slight stiff gait, but it didn't slow him down. He was home, but Franklin was not on the porch. He was standing by one of the isolated kennel runs. The one that had once held Wolf inside was a trembling hound mix sitting on the 3-legged stool. 6 feet from the gate was a young man in his 20s, 1:34:02. He was tense, his shoulders hunched. This was Mike, a veteran of a newer war, his hands shaking slightly. I don't get it, Mike said, his voice tight. I sit here, I do nothing. He just keeps shaking. Franklin no longer. The silent man stood calmly leaning against the fence. You're doing something. You're teaching him that your presence doesn't equal pain. Stop watching the dog. Mike watched the air around the dog. He's not scared of you. He's scared of what you might do. You just have to sit there quiet until he learns. You're not going to. Mike nodded, taking a shaky breath. 1:34:46. How long did it take you? With Wolf, Franklin looked over at his cottage where Wolf had just lifted his head, watching longer than it should have, but I had to learn the same lesson. Meredith came walking up, a clipboard in her hand. She wasn't just a vet tech anymore, she was a program director. She smiled at the scene. He's right, Mike, she said. Just breathe. She turned to Franklin. The donor check came through, the one from James. Franklin smiled. The phone call with James had led to another and another. The first awkward steps of 2 old friends finding their way back. He's a good man. 1:35:26. Franklin said. Our first Warriors and Friends meeting is next week, Meredith said, tapping the clipboard. We've got 5 handlers and 5 dogs. You ready? Franklin looked at Mike, still sitting bravely on the stool. He looked at the terrified hound. He looked at his cottage, his home. Wolf had gotten up and was walking toward him, his tail giving a low, slow wag. Franklin put his hand on Wolf's broad, strong head. He was no longer the silent man of the mountain. He was just Franklin, and he was finally home. Yeah, Franklin said, 1:36:05, his voice calm, and for the first time in 15 years, full of purpose. I'm ready. Franklin and Wolf's journey reminds us that our deepest wounds are often invisible, and that true healing rarely happens in isolation. It teaches us that sometimes the only way to save ourselves is to be brave enough to save someone else. If this story of patience and second chances touched your heart, we would be honored to read your own reflections in the comments below. Please consider sharing this story with someone who might need to hear it. 1:36:40. And join our community by subscribing so we can continue to share these journeys. The next tale is already waiting for you, and we hope you'll join us for it.